Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation, the little corner of the internet dedicated to discussing how adaptations of books differed from the original plot and themes. We return to House of the Dragon, the HBO prequel to Game of Thrones, based on Fire and Blood, written by my close personal friend George R.R. Martin. That's right, me and the G-Man have hung out. I stayed at his house for a few days, it's no big deal. He's really nice, by the way. He owns a bookstore in Santa Fe called Beastly Books. It's definitely worth going to if you're nearby. There's a lot of author-signed editions. He'd also just bought a railroad and turned all of the trains into giant direwolves that howl, and you can ride around on all day drinking margaritas. The dude is out there living his best life. It's awesome. Before anyone says anything mean, though, he's writing. He really is. Everyone needs to stop being jerks to him about that. The Winds of Winter isn't out yet because it's going to be a really, really long book, not because he's being lazy. Just, be cool. This is my leave George Martin alone moment. Anyways, to see my thoughts on how they adapted season 1, there's the thing. I've also done a video about the parts of the book that took place before the point that they chose to start the show at, so if you're curious about that, there is the other thing. Just as a quick reminder, Fire and Blood is written in the format of a history book that chronicles the first 130 years of the reign of House Targaryen over the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros, the second half of which pays particular attention to a war of succession known as the Dance of the Dragons. Spoiler warning for this season, and I will try my very best to keep my references to events of the book that haven't made it into the show yet to a bare minimum, but I can't promise there won't be any at all. As of the making of this video, season 2 has only been concluded for about a week, but the reviews so far have been a little mixed, with a lot of people feeling that the series had some really good individual moments, but was ultimately somewhat anticlimactic, and yeah, honestly, I can't disagree with that, but I might be able to explain it. I think we all need to appreciate what the showrunners were dealing with on this one. It's already fading out of memory at this point, but there was a massive writers and actors union strike in 2023 that ground almost every American production to a complete halt. Hot D was one of the few exceptions because they were exclusively filming abroad with predominantly British non-SAG actors. According to writer Sarah Hess in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, SAG had grudgingly agreed that she and showrunner Ryan Condal didn't have to abandon the project to join the picket line because their absence wouldn't have halted anything. But because of the impending strike, the polishing part of the writing process had to be significantly cut down, and they weren't able to make any of the small tweaks and rewrites to the script during filming that would usually have been a standard part of a production of this magnitude. So if any problems arose, they couldn't do anything about it aside from praying to the old gods and the new that they could fix it in post. This was an especially big problem when the show was cut down from 10 episodes to 8. Why exactly this happened isn't 100% confirmed currently. Showrunners can't exactly be honest about this sort of thing while they're actively trying to make their show, so Condal has made some vague, mostly bullshit-sounding comments about it being an artistic choice. There seem to have been some pretty loud denials that the studio had slashed their budget, but in a sort of the lady doth protest too much methinks kind of way that makes me pretty damn sure that that is exactly what happened. Word on the street is the original plan was to end on the huge climactic sea battle of the Gullet, but because of all this hoo-ha, they had to put that off until season 3. So, there you have it. If you thought that the season ended rather abruptly, that's because, to put it slightly hyperbolically, they had to tear off and shred the last 1/5 of the script and had about 20 minutes to rewrite it before their union demanded that they throw their pencils out the window. Now you might be thinking, well Dom, you gorgeous Anglo demigod, at least your close personal friend George R.R. Martin had already done a lot of the heavy lifting for them when he wrote the book. Well, unfortunately that leads me to the other major issue of this season. Let me put it this way. Going by the original hardcover page count, Season 1 of Game of Thrones covered all 694 pages of A Game of Thrones. Season 2 was all of A Clash of Kings, 768 pages. Season 3 got a little more complicated because that was the start of them splitting up the books and occasional chapters started showing up out of order, but it's approximately 3/4 of A Storm of Swords, 730 pages give or take. Season 4 was what was left of that book, giving it the least to work with so far at roughly 240 pages. In comparison, House of the Dragon Season 1 is 87 pages of Fire and Blood, and Season 2 is 17.5 pages, including the illustrations. I mean, look, I marked the beginning and end of the seasons. That tiny sliver betwixt the green markers in the middle there, that became over 8 hours of TV. I am aware that it's not entirely fair to compare House of the Dragon to Game of Thrones adaptation-wise because of the wildly different nature of the books they're based on. One is a narrative and the other is a fictional history book. In Fire and Blood, weeks, months, or even years can go by with every paragraph. Those 87 pages that went into season 1 covered a longer time period than all of the A Song of Ice and Fire books combined. That said, 17.5 pages is an awfully small amount of butter to spread over that much bread, Bilbo Baggins. I mean, this isn't a surprise. This was always going to be an issue with this particular adaptation. We don't know exactly when they plan to end the show, but even if they include the Aftermath and the Hour of the Wolf chapters, that's still only about 250 pages total, and that includes the stuff about the Great Council that was only one scene in the show. So writing a lot more stuff to fill in the gaps was always going to be a feature, not a bug here. If we were to make a scale that goes from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which were a straight-up adaptation of the books, to the Rings of Power, which was an entirely original story that just happened to be written in a popular intellectual property, I would say that House of the Dragon falls slap bang in the middle. So all this results in the show living or dying by how good the screenwriting was, and the screenwriting was rushed and underfunded. It was a miracle this season was watchable. Right, just one last thing, then I promise I'll start the comparison to the book. Do you guys remember back when I was first starting and I just jumped straight into it instead of all this build-up? Just a reminder that in the fiction of this novel, its historical events are being compiled by a man living in the post-Targaryen dynasty Baratheon Kings era, and primarily based on 3 sometimes contradictory and very biased first-hand accounts, which leaves a lot of the details and personal motivations a mystery or up to subjective interpretation. This intentional ambiguity makes it somewhat unique compared to most adaptations I review that are based on more traditionally written books, so I've divvied up the What They Changed section into things that might indeed be explained by the poor record keeping and things that genuinely contradict the original events of the novel. Thank you for bearing with me, my beautiful watchers. Let's talk adaptation. We pick up immediately where Season 1 left off, with Team Green having just rushed the coronation of Aegon II in King's Landing to seize power, and Team Black relatively just down the street on the small island of Dragonstone, trying to rally support from the 7 great houses of Westeros to even the odds. Currently, Team Black has no land army to speak of, but their allies, the Velaryons, have the only Westerosi fleet of ships on this side of the continent and are blockading the Gullet, causing starvation in the capital. Jacaerys Velaryon has a lot more luck in his diplomatic missions than his little brother Lucerys, convincing the Vale of Arryn and the North to join his mother's side, forming an immediate bond with Cregan Stark, who happens to have a few thousand older gentlemen who probably wouldn't survive the upcoming winter anyways, in need of honourable deaths in battle. Side note though, the wall is about 600 miles from Winterfell, which is a bit of a trek just to have a sick backdrop for your meeting, unless they're implying that Jace threw them both there, or Cregan just happened to be there when he arrived. You're right, it's me, Lord Stark. I'm here to make sure the wall's still there. Yep, still there. Sorry I gotta talk like this. Everyone from the North is under studio mandate to sound as much like Sean Bean as possible. Rhaenyra understandably neglects her queenly duties for a while devastated that her son recently became a low-calorie snack for Vhagar. Bad boy Daemon gets his own back on Team Green by sending 2 assassins, 1 thug and 1 rat catcher with access to the Red Keep, who decapitate Jaehaerys Targaryen, King Aegon's son and heir. These men were both codenamed Blood and Cheese in the book, which I don't think was ever said out loud in the show, but they did name the episode after them. Blood is caught trying to leave with the wee child's head and divulges his employer before dying. Obviously a tad upset by this, Aegon has all of the city's rat catchers executed to make sure they get Mr. Cheese as well. Growing tired of his Hand Otto Hightower's cautious approach to the upcoming civil war, Aegon fires him and gives his job to Christian Cole, who becomes the first on-screen character to have a book-accurate King's Hand chain of office, though it does appear to be welded to his armour. Cole has the bright idea to send Sir Arik to kill Rhaenyra disguised as his twin brother Eric, a scheme that results in the brothers tragically killing each other in single combat. Fun fact, this event was probably the most enduring memory of the entire Dance of the Dragons in Westeros' cultural zeitgeist hundreds of years later in the Song of Ice and Fire era. It's referenced by both Bran and Sansa in 2 separate books. Daemon flies his dragon Caraxes to the huge, if half-melted fortress of Harrenhal in the Riverlands and captures it single-handedly. Well, single-hand and single-dragon, without a fight, intending to use it as a rallying point to gather the armies of the local riverlords. In response, Cole marches an army from King's Landing to capture the nearby black-aligned Duskendale, then in a surprise move marches away from Harrenhal to lay siege to Rook's Rest, a small and fairly unimportant fortress dangerously close to Dragonstone. Taking the opportunity presented, Princess Rhaenys rides her impressive red dragon melees to save the castle, right into the trap devised by Cole and the mighty jaws of Vhagar. However, King Aegon and his golden dragon Sunfire are there too, and both suffer terrible wounds and burns during the fight. Cole making the tactical error of parading a dragon head through King's Landing is a solid thing to set up now, assuming later seasons stay reasonably book loyal. Advertising a dragon's fallibility and mortality will prove to be a very silly thing to do in front of people being pushed way out to the edge by hunger and harsh taxes. With his older brother all burninated, Aemond is made regent and starts commanding the green side of the war a lot more assertively. Down their strongest dragon, Team Black try the unprecedented idea of outsourcing the job of claiming and riding their currently unassigned dragons to non-Targaryen family members. This doesn't go great at first, as the Lord Commander of her Kingsguard, Sir Stefan, fails in his attempt and also gets all burninated, along with a bunch of other people claiming to be the illegitimate offspring of dragon houses. But eventually, a large man called Hugh and a drunken sot called Ulf are accepted by the dragons Vermithor and Silverwing, firmly tipping the odds of the war in the Black's favour. Also important to note that Rhaenyra's two youngest children are boarding a cog called the Gay Abandon to cross the narrow sea and wait out the war in the relative safety of the free cities, and in a case of deeply poor timing, 3 of said free cities have just been convinced to join the Green Team and are sailing a fleet in the opposite direction.
How will our brave heroes get out of this one? Join us in 2 years to find out. Same dragon place, same dragon channel.
The throne.
It's a big chair, made of swords.
But that's not important right now.
The original timeline's getting a little muddled, or at least elongated at places. For example, Daemon took Harrenhal before the Blood and Cheese incident, not because of it. I got the impression that they were putting off the battle at Rook's Rest for as long as possible to get the most out of Rhaenys and Aegon before she died and he spent the majority of the rest of the Dance of the Dragons half-conscious in bed. As I mentioned when I was reviewing Season 1, the show is kind of picked a side in a way that just wasn't present in the book, portraying Rhaenyra in as positive a light as possible and playing up Team Green as the obvious bad guys. It's not that Team Green didn't suck in the novel, it's more that everyone kind of sucked. The whole Dance of the Dragons was the result of both sides having a reasonable claim to the throne, depending on your interpretation of the laws of Westeros. Sexist laws for sure, but it's pseudo-medieval times, and neither side was willing to back down to avoid a devastating war. History remembering her way too harshly because she was a woman may well be a factor here, but in the novel, Rhaenyra feeling entitled to the crown, wanting power, and having way too much of an ego to ever compromise were at least part of her motivation, and the show is bending over backwards to make sure that's not the case now. It was ambiguous in the book how much Rhaenyra knew or approved of Daemon's more murdery actions, the Blood and Cheese incident in particular, but the show makes it clear in no uncertain terms that she absolutely did not authorize anything and was in fact completely devastated and furious at her uncle husband for doing it. We are reminded twice, once in a scene with Jace and another with a whole montage vision, that Rhaenyra's whole reason for fighting to be queen is not personal ambition, but an ancient duty to help fulfill her part in a secret prophecy that's been passed down the Targaryen generations. Rhaenyra alone shows mercy and integrity regarding the promises made to Mysaria, who has sort of been made the representative of the common folk in the show.
You showed me grace when you could have withheld it. I'm not often surprised.
And she takes a great personal risk in sneaking into the capital to try to make peace one last time. Everything I just described either wasn't mentioned in the book or actively contradicts it. There's also visual hints that we're supposed to be absolutely certain that she is the rightful ruler. In the book, both sides changed their flags to differentiate themselves. Aegon made his dragon gold to match his good boy Dreamfire, and Rhaenyra actually quartered hers and added the sigils of her mother and late husband's houses as well. So, originally, Aegon Aegon's banner was actually closer to the original, but in the show, the black background, the colour of House Targaryen, has been made Hightower green, distancing himself from his own claim, while Rhaenyra has been allowed to fully keep the OG design that we all know so well from all the merchandising. Meanwhile, the Queen Dowager Alicent, who the show has made pretty clear is the member of the Greens with the most genuinely honest intentions, is on a personal journey of revelation.
Are we the baddies?
She's increasingly dismissed by the Green Council, deals with finding out that her whole reason for pushing for Aegon's ascendancy might have been based on a misunderstanding brought about by unimaginative naming practices, and realizes that none of her children in the Red Keep are able to see around their own dicks for long enough to be leader material, culminating in her offering to help Rhaenyra take King's Landing. Presumably she'll replace the gold cloaks that opened all the gates because they missed their daddy Daemon so much. So Rhaenyra gets to constantly play the hero while the only sane person on Team Green realizes the error of her ways. So yeah, aside from those people who desperately want to step on Aemond, everyone is sure as fuck going to be Team Black, and I just don't think that was the intention of the book. Mysaria also gets a heck of a positive makeover in this season. She never left King's Landing in the book and was one of the primary architects of the blood and cheese travesty at Daemon's behest. Now she's on Dragonstone being the voice of the people, having fully outgrown her relationship with Daemon and apparently having a thing with his missus now. I did not see that coming, but I have zero gaydar, so I'm sure I missed a ton of hints. One of Aegon's infant children seems to have been erased, making Queen Sophie's choice that of willingly identifying the boy instead of the girl, instead of being forced to pick which of her two boys would die, which I think makes it clearer that this was an emotional decision, considering the rest of the world would have valued the boy more. FYI, in the book she chose the younger boy, but they killed the elder anyway. Controversial opinion, I know, but blood and cheese kinda sucked. Pick, he said, or we kill them all. On her knees weeping, Helena named her youngest Maelor. Perhaps she thought the boy was too young to understand, or perhaps it was because the older boy, Jaehaerys, was King Aegon's firstborn son and heir, next in line to the Iron Throne. You hear that, boy? Cheese whispered to Maelor. Your mama wants you dead. Then he gave Blood a grin, and the hulking swordsman slew Prince Jaehaerys, striking off the boy's head with a single blow. The Queen began to scream. Okay, so my personal beef with Season 2 mostly revolved around how much they were dragging out Daemon going cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs in Harrenhal with Alice Rivers while attempting to raise an army in the Riverlands. As I mentioned at the start, teasing 4 seasons out of less than half of a book and turning a fake history story into a more traditional narrative was always going to involve a lot of expository writing that concentrated on personal conflicts and development to fill out the runtime between the major events that the book exclusively concentrated on. That said, so much, just so much that happened in Daemon's part in Season 2 was derived from 2 sentences in the book, 2 non-sequential sentences, and it wasn't even an accurate portrayal of those sentences! The Lords of the Trident, having more to lose, were not so quick to move, but soon enough they began to throw in their lots with the Queen. Whatever her powers, it would seem that Daemon Targaryen was immune to them, for little is heard of this supposed sorceress while the prince held Harrenhal. Daemon having bad dreams and utterly failing to achieve his goals siphoned so much time out of an already shortened season, and I know this is somewhat subjective, but I just didn't find it particularly engaging. I mean, I guess it was nice to see Millie Alcock and Paddy Constantine again, but did we really need Daemon's Oedipal dreams or the ham-fisted reminder that as much as he and Aemond hate each other, they ultimately have more in common with each other than their own side? I mean, duh! We didn't need a Patchai to drive that point home, it already wasn't subtle. And it doesn't help that the rest of the cast seem to view his actions as rather pointless, dismissing the strategic importance of Harrenhal and the possibility of a Riverlord uprising, turning what was originally a solid tactical move into a tantrum. In addition to the castle, Prince Daemon at a stroke had captured the not inconsiderable wealth of House Strong and a dozen valuable hostages, among them Sir Simon and his grandsons. The sudden, bloodless fall of Black Harren's seat was counted as a great victory for Queen Rhaenyra and her Blacks. It served as a sharp reminder of the martial prowess of Prince Daemon and the power of Caraxes the Bloodworm, and gave the Queen a stronghold in the heart of Westeros to which her supporters could rally, and Rhaenyra had many such in the lands watered by the Trident.
Well, that castle is more crippled than I am, Your Grace. It is also penniless, as I happily control all of its gold.
Daemon, in the most base of ways, has a fight with his wife, gets in his car, and runs off to Harrenhal to conquer it.
For the record, despite what dressing up as him for Halloween that one time would suggest, I am not a Daemon stan. I don't give a shit if they make him look like a damn fool for an entire season, it's just that in this case it didn't make for particularly entertaining viewing. Alice Rivers has apparently changed professions from wet nurse to healer, who quite probably poisoned Lord Tully to get things moving for Daemon. Until the very last episode, I thought that maybe her being a witch was going to turn out to be a red herring suggestion, and Daemon was just suffering from the famous Targaryen madness, but then she gave him a legit vision of the future, so I guess she is magic, and Daemon was most certainly not immune to it. Hey Alice, blink twice of your Melisandre. Do it. But hey, I guess it was interesting to see the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy with visual aids, and we finally got confirmation that the prince that was promised was indeed supposed to be Daenerys Targaryen, which aligns perfectly with the way they chose to end Game of Thrones.
Who has a better story?
The only halfway good thing to come out of all this narrative wheel spinning was Oscar Tully, a popular new addition to the show's cast, and his turnaround from nervous kid to river boss willing to not only stand up to Daemon, but use him as a way to solidify his control over his bannermen. BT dubs, Oscar was originally the great-grandson of Grover Tully in the book, but I suspect the show didn't want to admit that he had a father called Elmo and a brother called Kermit. George! I had kind of mixed feelings about the river houses objecting to Lord Blackwood's pillaging of Bracken lands and his eventual execution for it. It's a fairly harmless change to the story, but it reminds me a little bit of the last season of Game of Thrones, where everyone suddenly had 21st century morals regarding the Geneva Convention. In Westeros and the real-life ye olde days of England that it's based on, minor nobles got into scraps and killed off each other's peasants all the time. It was just a thing. Commoners weren't really considered people. Everyone suddenly clutching their pearls because of a little looting and pillaging feels weird in this setting. But yeah, all this extra Riverland stuff is just show original drama. Everyone except House Tully came over with only a little hesitation. The Tullys remained neutral for the first part of the dance, which was actually kind of funny because the elderly Lord of Riverrun wanted to declare his loyalty to Aegon, but with the fiery vengeance of Caraxes just a short flight away in Harrenhal, his descendants elected to invoke the medieval power of attorney over him and locked him in his bedroom.
Let me out of here! Women can't be in charge. We'll end up going to war every time she gets her moon's blood. She'll be picking out her dresses all day while the Dornish illegals will be coming here and taking our jabs. Her small womanly mind can't comprehend the vast court. Aegon will make Westeros worthy again. Because he has a penis! You got to have a penis to sit on the Iron Throne! Open the door and go and fight the dragon for the Penis King!
So yeah, some silver linings, but for the most part, Daemon went from being the chaotic fan favourite of the series to the least interesting thing in the show right now. Another thing about the screenwriting that made me exponentially frustrated and concerned is the constant references to Viserys and Rhaenyra not wanting the crown.
She never even wanted it. The crown. She spared it no thought.
Well, that's perhaps why your brother gave the crown to her. Perhaps those who strive for it are the least suited to wear it.
Viserys never wanted it himself, if you recall. It came to him, and he did his best.
I never wanted it. I was right not to.
Now admittedly, part of my concern is just it once again reminds me of the god-awful writing in Season 8 of Game of Thrones and how much that hurt us all.
Have you considered the best ruler might be someone who doesn't want to rule?
Don't get me wrong, I get what they're trying to say here, that the people who lust for power for the sake of having power so much it blinds them tend to be despots and shitty rulers. That's fine, that's logical and historically proven. What does bother me is the associated implication that not wanting it at all is somehow better. That was explicitly disproven in A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. Robert Baratheon was a crap king because he didn't care about doing king stuff. More pressingly though, what the ever-living fuck are you talking about claiming Viserys and Rhaenyra didn't want it? Viserys put himself forward and had to advocate his claim at the Great Council. He had to run a for your consideration campaign on half the realm to get the crown. Why the heck would he do that if he didn't want to be king? And Rhaenyra Rhaenyra? Okay, yeah, I talked about how her motivations for wanting the throne have been made considerably more noble in the show, but to suggest that she didn't want it at all? Are we going to pretend like there wasn't an entire episode about her rage quitting and riding off into the woods when it looked like her brother might be named heir apparent over her? It's okay to want to be king, I'm just saying. You know? Mushroom, the dwarf jester, supposed close confidant of Rhaenyra and first-hand source for a lot of the historical knowledge of the book, was, according to himself, the guy who originally suggested looking for illegitimate Targaryen offspring to ride the spare dragons. His omission left this bright idea open to be claimed by pretty much any character on Team Black, and it looks like they divided the honor up between Jace, Misery, and a dragon. The lad had the initial idea of recruiting people who'd passed by the Targaryen family tree in the past, but apparently only noble families had entered his mind zone regarding this. And then, plot twist, Seasmoke took it upon himself to select his own rider. The former White Worm then quotes Mushroom's lines directly from the book, completing the thought.
But you are better served looking under the sheets and in the wood piles.
BT dubs, a lot of people took this to mean that Laenor Velaryon must have died off screen at some point, as the book tended to be pretty adamant that a dragon would never accept another rider while the old rider lived. My only thoughts on this would be it's continuously stated that no one fully understands the connection between dragon and rider, and no dragon rider has ever abandoned their dragon the way that Laenor did. It's entirely possible that dragons can decide, well, fuck you too, I'ma find me a new human. Adam and Alan of Hull are aged up quite a bit. They're like 14 and 15 when they're first discovered as possible dragon riders. This kind of buggers up the original pretense in which Corlys claimed them as his heirs, as it was originally put out that they were his late son Laenor's bastard children, and only the people who knew that Laenor was gay as hell suspected they were actually the sons of Corlys himself. They're adding extra flavor text to these characters by having them disagree on if they should use their lineage to improve their station in life and giving Alan hecking daddy issues. I have to admit, it kind of amused me that the red sewing took place all at once in the show. What was originally weeks of attempts from individuals to tame dragons is compressed into Rhaenyra just shoving about 100 people into the dragon caves to become a very distressed charcuterie board for Vermithor. Okay, I wouldn't usually be so crass as to comment on a woman's weight, but it is relevant to the adaptation review that my girl Rhaenyra T clearly be keeping it tight. It's suggested in the book that one of the causes of the growing rift in the Targaryen household was Rhaenyra being a jealous biatch that Alicent was skinnier than her. Childbirth exacted a toll on the princess. The weight that Rhaenyra gained during her pregnancies never entirely left her, and by the time her youngest boy was born, she had grown stout and thick of waist. The beauty of her girlhood a fading memory, though she was but 20 years of age. According to Mushroom, this only served to deepen her resentment of her stepmother, Queen Alicent, who remained slender and graceful at half again her age. Now obviously that motivation can be written off as Mushroom being a colossal douchebag, but it is possible to read Rhaenyra's dip in popularity amongst the lords and commoners of Westeros around the same time as she stopped being a sexy teen as a pretty cutting commentary on how attractive people tend to receive more support in real life. The last episode of this season introduced Sicario Lothar, played by YouTube's own Abigail Thorne. Like so many Game of Thrones characters before her, she appears to be a combination of multiple characters from the book. Lothar was the Lyseni admiral of the Triarchy fleet, but was only referenced twice in the novel, never visually described, and had zero dialogue. The character that Thorne is portraying has a lot more in common with Rakalio Rondoon, an eccentric gender-fluid Tyroshi pirate queen with a big purple beard, whom you can earn the respect of via mud wrestling, was generous with sharing their wives, and appreciated the value of both male and female lovers. They weren't super relevant to the events of the dance, but played an amusing role in Adam Valaryon's adventures in the years afterwards. B to the T to the W, I know they used male pronouns in the show, but they also referred to her as a she in the behind-the-scenes segment, and Abigail herself confirmed the character was female in an interview with Inverse, so I'm sticking with that. It was also kind of funny seeing Tywin Lannister getting all flustered at the demand that Westeros give up the Stepstones, as that was almost a joke in the book. Westeros never claimed or wanted those shitty rocks. Rhaena Targaryen and her giant Disney princess eyes appeared to have absorbed the role of a book character known as Nettles. She was a relatively mysterious character in the novel, described only as a little brown girl. She springs up out of nowhere during the sowing and manages to get the fugly dragon known as Sheepstealer to let him ride her by bribing him with, well, sheep. It's going to be interesting to see how much of Nettles' original story will be stuck to in later seasons, seeing as certain parts of it are now impossible now that they've shifted it to Daemon's daughter. Or at least I fucking hope so, my goodness. Sheepstealer was only one of 3 wild dragons that were chilling on Dragonstone in the book. There was the medium-sized grey ghost and the massive ill-tempered bugger called the Cannibal, neither of which were successfully claimed, mainly because they ate everyone who tried. You might have thought Vermithor was bad, but his kill count was significantly lower than any one of the ferals. This episode was not brought to you by HelloFresh. Targaryen bastards conveniently delivered right to your door in a variety of flavours. Probably the single best example of it wasn't written that way but sure was Aegon's involvement in the battle over Rook's Rest. As far as anyone involved in the book knew, the plan was always for him to be there. Even with Vhagar in play, it was better to have the maximum amount of dragons kicking ass, especially when you consider that Rhaenyra could have fielded at least 3 decent-sized dragons if she'd really wanted to. Aegon's now crashing the party. Everything was arranged behind his back between Cole and Aemond, and his arrival was considered a bad thing by all, especially those of us in the audience who recognize Sunfire as baby. No, don't hurt the baby! The show does a lot of build up to Aegon having all the feels about being worthless, unappreciated, and laughed at, until he's pushed too far by his mother telling him to shut up and do nothing while everyone else runs the kingdom and the war and whatnot. So he impulsively charges in and gets his ass handed to him. However, it makes total sense that people remembered this as a glorious battle that he just happened to lose because, well, you can literally hear the Greens telling everyone that that's what happened in the show.
The traitor dragon Meleys, slain at Rook's Rest by your king!
There's no suggestion in the book that Aemond had anything to do with Aegon's fall, but that also makes perfect sense. If people suspected he'd burninated his bro, he'd presumably have been in a spot of bother for the attempted regicide. It was nice to see one example of something being more intentional in the show versus the book, as the status quo until now had been to make everything an accident and strip the agency of all the major players. Oh, and Aemond was supposed to put on Aegon's crown, but I guess that's not important. It's kind of funny that there was so much speculation in the book about if Rhaenyra and Cole were bonking and who came onto who first, but apparently no one suspected he was giving the Queen Dowager a little something something on the side as well. The show takes it upon itself to explore the pushback over the danger of proving that common-born people can ride dragons too, and how butthurt Jace and the Dragon Shepherds got over it. But you know, in a way that makes perfect sense, as being considered closer to gods than men is a huge part of why the Targaryens are in charge and why they're allowed to get away with things like incest. It was never officially confirmed that Cheese was one of the rat catchers executed by Aegon, and while it's possible, it seems unlikely to me that he would have stayed at his original address and or continued with his rat catching job after the assassination, so all the men who died there were probably innocents just trying to do their fucking jobs. Another standout minor character introduced in this season was Hugh, the base-born bastard child of one of Old King Jaehaerys' wayward children. The show depicts him as a family man and selfless hero who would sacrifice himself for a woman he didn't even know, and while one cannot help but admire the Valyrian steel balls of a man who would yell in the face of a dragon, at least in a situation where it wasn't the deeply anticlimactic end to 8 years of build-up, that's pretty out of keeping with his book counterpart. Hugh the Hammer of Fire and Blood was described as a brave fighter in battle, but also a crude, thuggish man whose elevation to Dragon Rider gave him almost immediate hubristic aspirations to becoming a great Lord of Westeros, or even a king someday. I wrote down a lot more about this guy, then realised that it's not super relevant to this season in particular and would give away some pretty major spoilers. Suffice to say, I was initially confused about how this more heroic Hugh was going to follow the same path as his written equivalent, until I realised they'd already laid down the groundwork for his new motivation.
We'll go to my brother in Tumbleton.
Oh no, his wife's gonna be in Tumbleton. Oh shit. Anyways, Hugh gets a place in this maybe section because there's an unmissable prejudice towards commoners who have the gall to rise above their station in Westeros, so it's not hard to imagine all the learned men writing the histories villainizing him. Oh, and one last thing, I've read this book like 5 times now and I still have no idea what Otto is doing in a cage. Otto, is this a sex thing? You're back in the plot, stop messing around. Final thoughts. I think it would be very hard to overstate just how badly Season 2 suffers for having been assigned so little of the book and for the shortening of the series that robbed them of their big finale. It goes entire episodes with zero connection to the book, and what they wrote to take its place just wasn't very engaging. And I'm not just talking about the Doctor playing around in Luigi's mansion for 7 episodes. I feel like an unethical amount of filler was it was meetings. Aegon having meetings in King's Landing, Rhaenyra having meetings on Dragonstone, Daemon having meetings in Harrenhal, Aemon seizing power, and having more sodding meetings. God, so many of these meetings could have been an email. The season opened on Jace going to the Wall to talk to Cregan Stark and ended on Alicent sneaking to Dragonstone to talk to Rhaenyra. They're good scenes, but they're still just conversations at the end of the day, no matter how well written the dialogue is. But all of this would have retroactively felt less tiresome if the season had ended on a bang instead of yet more foreplay, but it didn't. We got a montage of all of the armies marching, but it cut to black right before any of them could meet each other. So all we're going to remember of this entire thing is one episode with, admittedly, the coolest dragon fight ever, and 7 episodes of meetings. And possibly that dream where Daemon bonks his mother, but that's not a good thing. I'm not done with this show, though. The showrunners are basically begging us to be patient for just a few more years so they can cover all the epic stuff that they couldn't include here, assuming they get the funding and don't have another massive roadblock thrown in their faces, and I, for one, am willing to do it. This season was a victim of circumstance, and the next few chapters of the book are pretty fucking action-packed, so unless they really screw them up, seasons 3 and 4 are going to be awesome. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers, and an extra special thanks on this one to my beloved patrons. I was doing an episode-by-episode coverage of the show as it came out exclusively on Patreon, and they were very helpful in picking up on the details I missed and correcting mistakes before I made a fool of myself on YouTube. So, I mean, thanks for funding doing what I love for a living and making me look smarter, guys. Oh, and one last thing before we part ways. This video represents the 10-year anniversary of Lost in Adaptation. I have been professionally pedantic about adaptations of books for a decade now. I can honestly say I had no idea this shit was going to last this long, so thanks for sticking by me, my beautiful watchers.